I was sitting at the breakfast table, coffee in hand and the morning paper spread out in front of me. Janet was still upstairs, probably deciding what to wear for the day. Everything about this morning felt routine, just like any other weekday over the past year. As my eyes scanned the front page, a headline near the center immediately grabbed my attention. Carmine had said it would happen last night, and as always, he wasn't one to make empty promises. The article reported a chilling crime. A man had been found murdered in his garage. The victim, Robert Tolson, worked for Calcas Realty Agency, the same place where Janet was currently employed. According to the report, he had been beaten and T.F. strangled. The police, it said, were still in the early stages of their investigation and had no suspects at the moment. I didn't feel the need to read any further, so I carefully folded the paper and placed it on the table, right where Janet always sat. A strange sense of comfort settled over me as I thought about how everything had led to this exact moment. Taking a sip of my coffee, I glanced up just as Janet walked into the room. She was breathtaking. Even after 5 years of marriage, she still managed to look more beautiful than the day we met. I wanted to tell her that, but the words stayed locked inside me. Janet didn't greet me either. She just poured herself a cup of coffee without a word. That had been our norm lately. It was hard to believe how far our marriage had deteriorated over the past year. Our eyes met briefly, and I gave her a small, polite smile, but she didn't respond. Ever since our blowout argument about her working longer hours, she'd retreated into this cold, distant version of herself. I missed the warmth she used to show during our early years together. Now, it felt like we were two strangers sharing the same house, and I couldn't help but wonder if we were nearing the end of the line. Janet picked up the newspaper with one hand, her coffee cup in the other. She started reading, but the moment her eyes landed on the headline about Robert Tolson's murder, she froze. Then, without warning, she choked on her coffee and nearly dropped the mug. "Oh God, no!" she cried, her face going pale as if she were about to be sick. Clutching her stomach, she ran out of the room and straight to the bathroom. I stayed in my seat, silent and unmoved. There was nothing for me to say, and frankly, I didn't feel the need to offer her any comfort. Taking a deep breath, I rose from the table, rinsed my coffee cup, and placed it in the dishwasher. I grabbed my briefcase and headed to the garage. I didn't bother checking on Janet before I left. Whatever she was feeling, it just didn't matter to me anymore. Let me take a moment to introduce myself. My name's John Cannella, though most of my friends just call me JC. I'm 29 years old, born and raised in the Italian neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My Sicilian roots run deep, and as a kid, I spent most of my time getting into trouble with a group of other Italian boys from the neighborhood. We called ourselves the Junior Mafia and thought we were unstoppable. While I could go on about the scrapes we got into, there's one event in particular that set my life on a very different path. That event involves Carmine Vitalo. He wasn't just my best friend. He was like a brother to me. Closer than blood. Even, we were inseparable back then. Two kids trying to carve out our own slice of the world. Carmine and I were the same age and ran with the same crowd of boys. But there was one key difference between us. Carmine had a knack for getting caught. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Carmine was dumb or anything like that. It was just that, no matter how careful we tried to be, trouble always seemed to find him, especially when the law was involved. One evening, we decided to break into a warehouse down by the docks. The plan was simple: grab some items we could sell quickly for cash. We thought we were being stealthy, slipping in through a side window, but apparently the security guards had spotted us. By the time we were ready to leave, lugging a few boxes of MP3 players, they were waiting for us. As we headed out, one guard grabbed Carmine by the arm just as I turned to see what was happening. Another guard lunged at me, but I managed to shove the box I was holding straight into his face. Then, with all the strength I could muster, I jumped onto the back of the guard holding Carmine and struck him hard on the side of his head. He staggered, letting Carmine go, and I pulled him to the ground, shouting for him to run. Without hesitation, Carmine bolted, leaving me behind to face the guards on my own. The second guard recovered quickly and caught me from behind. At that point, there wasn't much of a fight left in me. They roughed me up pretty badly before the cops arrived. When the police showed up, they didn't exactly handle things professionally. Instead, they stood there laughing with the guards as they looked me over, bruised, bloodied, and barely able to stand. I was hauled off to the station and tossed into a holding cell until my parents came to bail me out. To make a long story short, I never gave up Carmine's name during the investigation. I ended up serving 2 weeks in jail, followed by probation. Carmine called me several times afterward, full of guilt and apologies for leaving me behind, but I told him it was fine. With his record, he would have faced far more time than I did, and I wasn't about to let that happen. He swore he'd make it up to me someday, no matter how long it took. My parents, however, were furious. My dad didn't hold back his anger, punishing me with his leather belt until my skin was raw. Humiliated by my arrest, they decided enough was enough and enrolled me at St. Peter's Catholic High School, hoping the nuns and priests would straighten me out. And to their credit, they did. By the time I reached my senior year, I had turned my life around. One of the priests, who had taken me under his wing, encouraged me to pursue a better future. With his guidance, I left behind the neighborhood gang and focused on my studies. My hard work paid off. I managed to get into Penn State. College was a fresh start for me. I graduated with a degree in human resources and landed a job at a well-respected company soon after. For the first time in years, my parents were genuinely proud of me. During my time in college, I dated a few women, but I wasn't looking for anything serious back then. It wasn't until 3 years after graduation that everything changed. That's when I met Janet Ficano. She was the kind of woman who could make a man rethink his priorities. We met at an HR seminar of all places. Afterward, I mustered up the nerve to ask for her number, and to my relief, she gave it to me with a smile. She seemed genuinely pleased when I promised to call her. Janet was different from anyone I'd ever dated before. She was captivating in a way that went beyond looks, complex, intelligent, and full of surprises. From the moment we met, I could tell there was something special about her. Janet's personality was a fascinating mix of complexity and charm. Sometimes, she reminded me of Chris Costner's character in The 3 Faces of Eve, effortlessly shifting between different aspects of herself. However, there was one trait that I struggled to admire: her unyielding stubbornness. Once Janet made up her mind about something, it didn't matter how flawed or misguided her opinion was. She wouldn't budge. Our dating life was a series of ups and downs. There were stretches of closeness, followed by moments where she seemed to pull away. One thing that stood out, though, was our decision to avoid intimacy during the first year of our relationship. It was during that time I learned about Janet's difficult past. She had been abandoned as an infant. Her mother left her on a church pew and disappeared from her life. Growing up in orphanages and foster homes left its mark on her, and I couldn't help but think that missing out on maternal love during her formative years had shaped some of her struggles as an adult. Despite everything, Janet had a warmth and tenderness that captivated me, especially during those early years. She was, without question, the most affectionate person I'd ever known. My parents, however, were far less enthusiastic about our relationship. They were skeptical from the start and often warned me against getting too deeply involved with her. But I didn't listen. I loved Janet, and their disapproval wasn't going to change that. Eventually, we tied the knot in a simple ceremony at our local church. It wasn't extravagant, but it was exactly what we wanted. We also agreed to hold off on starting a family until we felt more financially secure and Janet could stay home full-time as a mother. My parents had their opinions about that decision too, but we stuck to our plan. The first major strain on our marriage came in the 3rd year. Janet's company was acquired by a larger corporation, and she lost her job. It hit her hard. She had loved that job, and even though we weren't struggling financially, the loss left her in a deep depression. It took months for her to find a new position as an office manager at Calcas Realty Agency. It wasn't a role she was passionate about, and I could tell she was settling for something less than she wanted. During her unemployment, I did my best to be supportive, but there were moments when I felt she resented me. My own career was stable and fulfilling, while she felt adrift. Her mood swings became more intense, particularly during certain times of the month. However, once she settled into her new job, things slowly improved. She began to regain the cheerful and loving side of herself that I had missed so much. Even our physical relationship, which had suffered during her period of joblessness, began to thrive again. For a while, it felt like Janet was overcompensating for the rough patch we had been through. She became more assertive in the bedroom, almost as if she were trying to make up for lost time. I wasn't about to complain. Those 9 months of renewed intimacy brought us closer together. I was thrilled to see her embracing her role at Calcas Realty, even taking the initiative to enroll in a home study course in real estate. It felt like we had turned a corner, and I was proud of the effort she was putting into her personal and professional growth. Life seemed to stabilize, but then came a mix of good and bad news. On the bright side, my career was thriving. After 5 years with my company, I was steadily climbing the management ladder, and my future looked brighter than ever. But as is often the case, the good news didn't come without its share of challenges. A merger was looming on the horizon. The merger with an Atlanta-based company brought some major shifts to my job. I was tasked with integrating their staff into our corporate structure, which included training their personnel and making tough decisions about staff reductions. While I was excited about the new challenges, there was a downside. I'd have to travel more frequently and spend longer stretches away from home. Janet didn't take the news well. The idea of me being gone so often was upsetting to her, even though I assured her that I'd make every effort to be home on weekends, no matter how long the trips were. At first, she seemed to accept it, though not without some resentment. But over time, it became clear that my weekend returns weren't enough to bridge the gap created by my extended absences. Her frustration slowly escalated. She began accusing me of enjoying my time away more than I let on, and even hinted at the possibility that I had a lover in Atlanta. I was stunned. I tried everything to reassure her. Daily phone calls, sending her flowers, and even adding humorous cards to lighten her mood. But nothing seemed to break through her growing aloofness. After nearly 6 months, the training program in Atlanta finally came to an end. I was relieved to put the constant travel behind me, and the promotion I received at corporate headquarters felt like the cherry on top. I naively believed that settling back into a regular routine would help mend things between us. But I was wrong. Instead of reconnecting, Janet seemed to pull further away. She started pouring even more hours into her job at the agency. When I asked her why, she snapped back with a sarcastic remark, saying it was her turn to work for a promotion, and that maybe I'd finally understand what it felt like to spend my evenings alone. That stung more than I cared to admit. Our relationship grew more strained, and the distance between us felt almost insurmountable. About 2 weeks ago, Janet told me she'd be heading out for the weekend with some colleagues to attend a developer's session for a high-rise condominium project near the riverfront. She insisted it was vital for her career and didn't bother asking if I had any objections. It was clear her mind was made up, and there was no point in arguing. Feeling the weight of the tension at home, I decided to reconnect with an old friend. Though I'd left the junior mafia behind in high school, I'd stayed close to a few of the guys, especially Carmine. I gave him a call and asked if he wanted to catch the Steelers-Raiders game on Sunday. He didn't hesitate for a second, agreeing right away. Carmine had a knack for scoring the best seats for Steelers games, and I figured it would be a good distraction from everything going on at home. When I mentioned Janet's weekend business trip to Carmine, he quickly suggested I spend the weekend with him and the guys, catching up on all the latest neighborhood gossip. The idea of a little escape from home sounded like exactly what I needed, so I didn't bother telling Janet about my plans. That Friday morning, the air was crisp and chilly as we sat at the breakfast table. Over coffee, I casually asked Janet how I could reach her while she was away. Her response was cold and dismissive. She said she'd be busy with important people and didn't want any interruptions. Her tone made it clear she saw me more as an inconvenience than her husband. I bit back my frustration and let it drop. Later that day, Janet packed up and left for Atlantic City without so much as a goodbye worth remembering. Meeting up with Carmine that evening felt like a reunion long overdue. It had been over a year since we'd last spent time together. I was one of the few from our old neighborhood who managed to get out without a criminal record to my name. During our catch-up, Carmine brought up a debt he still felt he owed me, promising to return the favor whenever I needed. His sincerity was reassuring, even if the context wasn't exactly conventional. Saturday night, Carmine and I ended up at the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge on the southeast side of town. The place was straight out of a mob TV series, resembling the Bada Bing Club from The Sopranos. The joint was packed with scantily clad dancers working the floor and the stage. The atmosphere buzzed with loud music, flashing lights, and a kind of energy I hadn't been around in years. At one point, a dancer, barely looking older than 18, sidled up to me, her moves provocative and undeniably tempting. Carmine, ever the instigator, leaned in and mentioned that she was available for the night, emphasizing that she could be mine if I wanted. I couldn't deny the pull of temptation, but something inside me refused to cross that line. I shook my head and told him, plainly, that I wasn't interested. "I'm married," I said firmly, as much to myself as to him. I made vows, and those still mean something to me. The young woman, sensing my lack of interest, moved on to another table where a man welcomed her attention without hesitation. Carmine raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Wow," he said with a mix of disbelief and amusement. "You're really serious about that fidelity thing, huh?" "Dead serious," I replied. "Without fidelity, there's nothing. No love, no trust, no marriage." He let it go after that, but the exchange left a mark on me. For all the turmoil Janet and I had been through, my commitment to her hadn't wavered, even when the cracks in our relationship seemed to widen daily. The next morning arrived with the kind of cold, blustery weather that Pittsburgh is famous for. The wind cut through layers of clothing, but it didn't stop the sea of fans making their way to Three Rivers Stadium for the Steelers versus Raiders game. The rivalry between these two teams was as fierce as ever, fueled by decades of unforgettable showdowns. One of the most iconic moments, of course, was the Steelers' legendary victory snatched from the Raiders in what many call the NFL's most miraculous play. Franco Harris's legendary play was etched into every Steelers fan's memory. The improbable reception that turned a hard-fought defensive game against the Oakland Raiders into an unforgettable victory. That game at Three Rivers Stadium, the Steelers' first ever playoff matchup, left a legacy neither team has let go of. Honestly, it's probably a good thing weapons aren't allowed on the field. The intensity of that rivalry borders on war. This season, however, wasn't shaping up to be one of the Steelers' finest. Sitting at 5 wins and 5 losses, today's matchup against the Raiders felt like a defining moment. The stadium was electric, filled with roaring fans and hard hits on the field. By the time the final whistle blew, the score stood at Steelers 21, Raiders 20. It was the kind of narrow victory that reminded me why I loved the game. I left the stadium feeling elated, convinced the day couldn't have ended on a higher note. Carmine, ever the party enthusiast, invited me to celebrate, but I had to turn him down. Monday promised to be a grind at work, and the last thing I needed was to tackle it with a pounding hangover. Besides, Janet was supposed to return home that evening, and despite everything, I wanted to be there when she got back. But Janet never came home that night. Monday morning arrived with a heaviness I couldn't shake. As I left for work, doubts about my marriage swirled relentlessly in my mind. Every time I thought about Janet and me, an uneasy feeling crept over me, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. Sure, every marriage goes through its rough patches, but this felt like something deeper, something broken beyond repair. Work that day was as chaotic as I'd anticipated, with back-to-back high-level meetings and a messy discrimination lawsuit dominating the agenda. It wasn't until 5:30 in the evening that I finally had a moment to breathe and check my emails. My inbox was flooded. Updates on the lawsuit, memos from staff, and the usual barrage of daily tasks. Near the bottom of the list, an email caught my attention. The subject line read, "Who was the last one to know?" Thinking it was some kind of humorous animation or office joke, I opened it. But what appeared on my screen wasn't funny at all. It was a photo of Janet, my Janet, locked in a passionate kiss with another man. At the bottom of the photo, there was a text message that read, "Want to know what happened after this? Click the next link." A cold chill raced down my spine. For a moment, I just stared at the image, unable to believe what I was seeing. My wife, the woman I had vowed to love and cherish, was in another man's arms, their lips pressed together in a way that left no room for doubt. With trembling hands, I clicked the next link. Another photo filled the screen. This time, Janet and the man were both unclothed, standing together in a motel room. The text below, it was almost identical. Want to know what happened after this? Click the next link. My chest tightened, and my throat felt like it was closing up. A part of me wanted to stop there, to shut down the computer and pretend none of it was real. But I couldn't. Something inside me, whether it was anger, disbelief, or sheer masochism, drove me to click the link. The final photo shattered me. There was Janet on the bed on all fours with the same man from the previous photos. Her face displayed an expression of unrestrained lust and ecstasy, one I hadn't seen in a long time. In that moment, the truth hit me like a freight train. The woman I had loved with all my heart, the woman I trusted completely, was an adulteress. I sat there, paralyzed by the betrayal. My mind struggled to process the reality of what I was seeing. Janet, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had not only broken my trust, she had ripped my heart from my chest. The love I had poured into our marriage now felt like a cruel joke. At the bottom of the photo, in stark, mocking text, were the words, "Prick provided by Robert Tolson." My worst nightmare had been delivered directly to my screen, impossible to ignore. It became clear that Janet's recent coldness toward me wasn't just a wife upset with her husband. It was more like rigor mortis setting into a marriage that was already dead. Strangely, I didn't feel the explosive anger I might have expected. Instead, I was overcome by a cold, focused resolve, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Revenge began to take root in my mind. I wouldn't allow infidelity and betrayal to go unpunished. Two people, Janet and Robert, would pay dearly for the humiliation they had inflicted upon me. As my thoughts churned, I couldn't ignore the mystery of the email's sender. There was no name, no indication of who had exposed Janet's betrayal. The questions buzzed incessantly in my mind. Why send this email? What did they hope to gain? Were they an enemy of Janet's or mine? I couldn't dwell on it for long. The answers to those questions would have to wait. I grabbed a blank CD, inserted it into my computer, and copied the email along with the damning photos. Once I had a secure backup, I deleted the email and ran a scrubber program to erase all traces of it from my hard drive. Leaning back in my swivel chair, I tried to make sense of what Janet had done. I could only attribute it to her fractured, complex personality. Still, if she had wanted out of the marriage, I would have granted her a divorce. We could have walked away from the wreckage, each with our dignity intact. But now there would be no mercy. My revenge would be swift, thorough, and final. The plan started to take shape in my mind. Leaving the office, I found a payphone a block away. Using an untraceable burner phone I kept for emergencies, I called Carmine. "It's time," I told him. "I'm ready to collect on that favor you owe me." When I got home around 7:30 that evening, Janet was already there, sitting on the couch with the TV on. She didn't bother to get up or greet me. Instead, she casually commented, "You're home late." I paused in the doorway, locking eyes with her. "You've been coming home late yourself," I replied evenly before heading into the kitchen. The tension was palpable as silence stretched between us. Grabbing a beer, I retreated to my office and locked the door behind me. Sitting at my desk, I reflected on the nature of revenge. In our justice system, a person convicted of a capital crime typically faces one of two outcomes: the death penalty or life imprisonment. My plan would deliver one of each. Robert Tolson would face the former, and Janet would experience the latter. I needed time to refine every detail. Carmine would take care of Robert. As for Janet, I planned to make her departure look like a simple case of a wife leaving her husband. To lay the groundwork, I sent flowers to her office and made dinner reservations at a restaurant near her workplace. I left her a message asking her to meet me there. When she failed to show, I made sure the maitre d' noted that my wife had stood me up, even instructing him to give our reserved table to someone else. Janet came home late that evening without offering any explanation. She didn't apologize or give a reason for missing our dinner plans, and honestly, I didn't care. Whatever excuse she might have given was irrelevant to me now. The die had been cast, and the wheels of revenge were already turning. The following day, a courier delivered an envelope to my office. It was marked personal and confidential, and inside was a single sheet of paper. The bold heading at the top instructed me to destroy it after reading. The first sentence advised me to secure an airtight alibi for the upcoming night. The second provided a name, Carlos Mandara, along with a phone number. I read the note over and over, committing the name and number to memory before shredding the paper. After reading the note, I shredded it into tiny pieces. To ensure discretion, I collected the scraps and dropped them into several different trash cans outside the office building as I headed home that evening. Once I arrived, I changed into more comfortable clothes, poured myself a generous glass of Jim Beam, and sank into my chair with some smooth jazz playing in the background. The TV stayed off. It was my night to reign as king of my castle, and Janet would have to find her own way to pass the time. When Janet got home, she took one quick look at the scene, then turned and walked right back out the door. I didn't care where she was headed. Whether she was grabbing a late dinner or meeting up with Robert Tolson, it didn't matter anymore. Their hourglass was almost empty, and both of them were on borrowed time. By the time Janet returned, I was already in bed. She slipped quietly under the covers beside me, the silence between us deafening. I didn't say a word and drifted off to sleep without acknowledging her presence. Thursday nights were my usual poker nights with a few guys from work, held in the back room of the old Stagecoach bar. This weekly routine served as my perfect airtight alibi. That evening, I stayed late, playing hand after hand, and when I finally returned home, the clock on my nightstand read 2:35 a.m. Janet didn't stir as I crawled into bed, and I didn't waste any time falling asleep, even though I knew exactly what had transpired earlier that night. Robert Tolson had received his pass-away penalty, and justice, in its own way, had been served. Now it was time to shift my focus to Janet. Her punishment, life imprisonment, so to speak, wouldn't require immediate action. It would begin after a single phone call, setting the wheels in motion. As I lay there, I felt no remorse or compassion for the woman I had once loved so deeply. Whatever warped part of her personality had driven her to betray me so brazenly, it wasn't my problem anymore. The consequences she faced were entirely of her own making. The days that followed saw the police combing through every aspect of Robert Tolson's life, including his workplace. Detectives interviewed every member of the Calcas Realty Agency staff, piecing together a collection of statements that were more interesting than consistent. Janet, of course, wasn't spared. She was called in for multiple interviews. Detective Lawrence Beck eventually turned his attention to me. During his questioning, he tiptoed around the possibility of a more than professional relationship between Robert and Janet. I played the role of the devoted husband, expressing complete confidence in my wife's fidelity and brushing off any insinuations. Detective Beck just gave me a small, knowing smile, as though he pitied me for being the poor, betrayed man everyone likely assumed I was. Robert's funeral took place the following Tuesday. That morning, I saw Janet dressed in the same somber black dress she'd worn to my mother's funeral. She didn't bother asking if I wanted to accompany her to the service, and I didn't offer. Whatever thoughts she had about Robert's death, she kept to herself, though I could see the weight of it all pressing down on her. No doubt her mind was swirling with questions about the murder and the mess her infidelity had left behind. Over the next week, Janet made a few attempts to engage me in serious conversations about our relationship. Whether it was guilt, fear, or some misguided hope for reconciliation, I didn't know and didn't care. Every time, I met her efforts with cold indifference, effectively shutting her down before she could get too far. Janet's attempts to reconcile fell flat every time. I had long since moved past any possibility of making amends. At this point, the power to end the charade was entirely mine, and I could pull the plug whenever I decided. 3 weeks after Robert's death, the police investigation appeared to stall. No new leads surfaced, and speculation began swirling that Robert's execution might have been the work of a loan shark or a bookie. Meanwhile, Janet's mental state continued to deteriorate. She became increasingly absent-minded and seemed to live in a constant state of confusion. The smallest things startled her, and yet, I offered no comfort or support. As I watched her unravel day by day, all I could think was, too bad. Finally, on the following Thursday, I made the call to Carlos. The plan was already in motion, and he was eager to carry it out. Janet's remaining time in her familiar life could now be measured in mere hours. Friday morning, I left the house before Janet had even gotten out of bed. I had no interest in a final encounter. Across the street, a car waited with two men inside, ready for their carefully orchestrated task. The abduction happened at a four-way stop near our neighborhood. Janet's car was trapped by vehicles in front and behind, leaving her no escape. With the precision of a military operation, the two men acted swiftly. One opened her car door and administered a quick injection to her arm, while the other cut her seatbelt. Janet was pushed into the passenger seat, and one of the men slid into the driver's seat. Within 30 seconds, all three cars were gone, leaving no witnesses behind. At 11 a.m., a woman made up to look exactly like Janet walked into a branch bank on the east side of town. She presented a withdrawal slip for $25,000 from our joint account, along with a driver's license and passport as identification. The teller, after verifying everything, issued the funds in the form of a cashier's check. A security guard even escorted the woman to her car, noting the license plate as she drove off. Later that day, the Janet lookalike appeared at the American Airlines ticket counter. The line was short, and she quickly obtained a boarding pass after presenting the same photo ID and passport. The flight reservation had been made online the night before. The itinerary included a flight from Pittsburgh to JFK Airport in New York, followed by a non-stop flight, American Airlines Flight 951, to Rio de Janeiro. The first leg of the journey departed Pittsburgh at 4:45 p.m., reaching JFK at 10:30 that night. By the time the plane took off for Brazil, it carried a passenger listed as Janet Canella on an overnight flight to Rio. I waited until Saturday at noon before reporting Janet as missing. Surprisingly, Detective Lawrence Becton himself showed up at my house to take the report. I explained that Janet had returned home at her usual time the previous day but had since vanished. Attempts to reach her cell phone had been futile, as her number now returned a not-in-service message. I also mentioned reaching out to Amanda Stata, one of Janet's close friends at Calcas Realty, who confirmed that Janet hadn't shown up for work on Friday and hadn't called in to explain her absence. Detective Becton scribbled cryptic notes into his notepad, occasionally glancing up at me with an unreadable expression. After gathering the basic details, his questions shifted toward the state of my marriage. He probed gently but persistently, trying to uncover whether any marital issues might have contributed to Janet's disappearance. I reiterated the same story I'd been telling everyone. The story of a devoted husband who had no reason to believe his wife was anything but faithful and reliable. I told Detective Becton that, aside from the stress surrounding Robert Tolson's murder investigation, our marriage had been fine. I couldn't think of any reason Janet would choose to disappear on her own. His next question, though, came sharp and direct. Did you have any involvement in foul play concerning Janet? Without missing a beat, I emphatically declared my love for her and insisted I could never harm her. Lying to the police was a skill I'd honed early in life, thanks to my days running with the junior mafia. It was a talent that still served me well, and in this moment it was a crucial tool in my arsenal. 3 days later, Detective Becton paid me an unexpected visit at my office during business hours. I assumed his intention was to observe me in my professional environment, perhaps trying to gauge the kind of man he was dealing with. When he arrived, he settled into the chair across from my desk, his expression a tight-lipped mix of politeness and suspicion. I met him with the demeanor of a concerned and distressed husband, immediately asking if there was any news about Janet's whereabouts. He began by recounting Janet's activities on the morning of her disappearance. According to Becton, witnesses placed her at a Denny's restaurant on Bennett Street, having coffee around 10 a.m. on Friday. He added that video surveillance confirmed her presence at the Oligon National Bank an hour later, at 11 o'clock. There, she made a withdrawal of $25,000 from our joint savings account. As he shared these details, I put on my best performance of disbelief and confusion. "That's impossible," I said, my voice thick with supposed shock. "Janet never mentioned anything about withdrawing money. Why would she do that?" Detective Becton didn't flinch. He explained that the bank teller had taken photocopies of Janet's driver's license and passport before issuing the cashier's check. "I'm confident that when you see the surveillance footage," he said, "you'll recognize the person at the cashier's window as your wife." I made sure to maintain a bewildered expression, shaking my head slightly as if I were trying to make sense of something unthinkable. "This doesn't sound like Janet at all," I said. "There must be some mistake." Janet and I discuss everything, especially matters as significant as this. Detective Becton studied me closely, pausing to let his revelations sink in. I could tell he wasn't finished. He was holding back the most damning information, preparing to drop it like a hammer. Internally, I readied myself for another performance, knowing I had to stay in control. He finally delivered the blow. "There's more," he said. "We've confirmed that your wife purchased airline tickets to New York and then to Rio de Janeiro. Her car was found in the long-term parking lot at the Pittsburgh airport. Records show her flight departed Pittsburgh at 4:45 p.m. on Friday, and her connecting flight to Rio left New York's JFK airport at 10:30 that night." He added that the police had contacted authorities in Rio, but Janet seemed to have disappeared upon arriving. There was no trace of her after she landed. Detective Becton fixed his gaze on me, clearly waiting for a reaction. I didn't disappoint. Slamming my hands down on the desk, I exclaimed, "This is madness. Janet would never just vanish like this." My voice cracked with what I hoped came across as genuine anguish. The detective continued to watch me intently, as if trying to decide whether he believed my reaction or if he suspected something more. I stared back at him, keeping my expression a carefully controlled mix of shock and disbelief. This was a game of wits, and I couldn't afford to lose. I looked directly at Detective Becton and stated firmly, "Janet would never do something like this." I emphasized my unwavering belief in her love for me and mine for her, insisting that the idea of her fleeing the country was completely absurd. To sell the image of a betrayed husband, I allowed my emotions to surface, tears welling up in my eyes as I broke down in front of him. For a moment, the room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the office air conditioning. The detective leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence. "Do you think this could have any connection to the homicide of Robert Tolson?" he asked. I recoiled as though the question itself was an insult. "How can you even ask that?" I shot back, my voice tinged with indignation. Janet had nothing to do with Robert's murder. She was interviewed thoroughly and wasn't charged with anything. Detective Becton nodded but clarified, "That's true. We never charged your wife. However, I should tell you she's still high on our list of suspects." The statement struck like a thunderclap, but I maintained my composure. "That's ridiculous," I said, raising my voice slightly for emphasis. "If you're basing this on office gossip about Janet and Robert, it's absurd. You need more than rumors to make such an accusation stick." I met his gaze directly, my eyes locking onto his in a show of defiance. "Do you honestly believe Janet had any part in that? Office talk doesn't make her a killer." The detective didn't flinch. "We're still investigating," he explained, his tone steady but deliberate. "And now that your wife has left the country, our suspicions about her involvement in Tolson's murder have only grown." He paused, as if weighing his next words, then continued. "Evidence at the crime scene suggests a carnal motive. Tolson was tortured for hours before being strangled." I let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Carnal motive? Do you seriously think Janet, my petite wife who can barely open a pickle jar, tortured and strangled a grown man? That's absurd." My frustration grew as I leaned back in my chair, shaking my head. "You're building baseless accusations out of thin air," I said, my tone edged with irritation. Detective Becton remained calm. We're not suggesting she acted alone. It's possible she had assistance. I blinked, caught off guard by the implication. Assistance. I repeated, the word hanging in the air. My voice was steady, but my mind raced. Before I could say more, he clarified. We've considered the possibility of her having help, but you have a solid alibi for the time of the homicide. Despite his words, there was a slight hesitation in his voice, as if he wasn't entirely convinced. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes at him. So, let me get this straight. You think my wife left the country because she's involved in a homicide, and somehow, I'm now a potential suspect in helping her. My tone dripped with disbelief as I let the words sink in. Detective Becton remained silent, studying me closely. I could feel his eyes trying to penetrate the mask of outrage and confusion I had carefully constructed. After a long pause, I added, with a faint trace of scorn, if I've understood your position correctly, I think we're done here. I rose from my chair, walked to the office door, and opened it. If there's nothing else, Detective, I have work to do, I said, gesturing toward the exit. He hesitated for a moment, his expression unreadable, before standing and making his way to the door. Without another word, he stepped out, leaving me alone in the office. Detective Becton rose from his chair, moving toward the door with deliberate slowness. Thank you for your time, Mr. Canella. I'll keep you updated on your wife's disappearance, he said, his tone measured but distant. He didn't extend his hand for a shake, and I didn't offer mine. Once he was gone, I closed the door behind him and sank back into my swivel chair, replaying every word of our conversation in my mind. It was clear to me that Becton's visit was less about sharing information and more about probing for clues, something that might slip past me if I wasn't careful. He was fishing, trying to find cracks in my story, but my alibis were rock solid. I had been playing poker the night Robert Tolson met his end, and on the Friday when Janet disappeared, I was tied up in meetings all day. I knew Becton suspected me, but he didn't have anything concrete to go on. 2 weeks passed after Janet's disappearance, and I hadn't heard a word from Carlos or Carmine. Janet's whereabouts and condition remained a mystery, and though I outwardly projected calm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. During my morning commute and evening drives home, I often caught glimpses of the same car trailing me at a distance. My movements were meticulous. Work, home, the occasional grocery stop, but I made sure there was nothing in my behavior that could suggest evasion or guilt. Every other day, I called Detective Becton for updates about Janet. Each time, his answer was the same. No new information. The Brazilian police had found no sign of Janet after her arrival in Rio, and the trail had gone cold. That Saturday afternoon, I ordered a pizza from Domino's while watching college football on TV. When the doorbell rang, I answered it to find the delivery guy holding my order. I paid him, handed over a small tip, and carried the pizza box into the kitchen. As I opened it, something unexpected caught my eye. A plain envelope sitting on top of the pizza. Curious and a little uneasy, I tore the envelope open to find a single sheet of paper inside. The note contained specific instructions. The next morning, I was to dress for church and attend the 10 a.m. Mass at St. Peter's. During communion, I was to slip out of the east side door, where a dark Ford Crown Victoria would be waiting for me. As I held the note in my hands, its meaning became clear. This was going to be my final meeting with Janet before Carlos carried out the next phase of the plan, shipping her out of the country. Carlos had waited 2 weeks, ensuring that the well-documented narrative of Janet flying to Rio was firmly embedded in the police investigation. It was a clever deception. By establishing that Janet was alive when she boarded the plane, Carlos had effectively created a dead end for the authorities. Without a body, the police couldn't build a circumstantial case against me. Later that night, I lay in bed staring at the pitch-black ceiling. The last month and a half had been a living nightmare. Ever since that damning email landed in my inbox, my life had unraveled in ways I hadn't thought possible. The chain of events was a grim reminder of the darkness within me, a darkness deeply rooted in my Sicilian heritage. Whether it was nature or nurture, I couldn't deny the truth. My ancestral roots had forged a part of me that refused to let disrespect go unanswered. The next morning, I arrived at St. Peter's as instructed. The church was enormous, its vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows creating an atmosphere both solemn and imposing. The 10 a.m. Mass was well attended, with rows of parishioners filling the pews. I sat quietly, waiting for communion, knowing that when the moment came, I'd have to play my part perfectly. The 10 a.m. Mass at St. Peter's was packed, with several hundred parishioners filling the pews. The sheer size of the crowd made it easy to blend in, ensuring I wouldn't stand out if anyone was watching. If the police were trailing me, they likely waited outside, unwilling to risk drawing attention in such a public place. As the congregation began moving toward the front of the church for communion, I slipped quietly out the side door as instructed. A dark Ford sedan was parked outside, engine idling. I climbed into the back seat without hesitation, and the car immediately merged into the flow of traffic, its powerful engine humming beneath me. The ride was short, 10 minutes at most, before the car pulled up in front of a large, nondescript warehouse. The driver didn't turn around, simply instructing me to enter through the side door. Inside, the warehouse was vast and mostly empty. Toward the back, an office area was lit by the soft glow of several windows. As I approached, Carlos stepped out, meeting me halfway. It was the first time we'd come face to face. "Carmine said I could call you JC," Carlos began, extending a hand. We shook briefly, his expression unreadable. Carlos wasted no time. "Before you see her, I need to warn you, Janet's condition has changed. It might be upsetting." I met his words with indifference. "I don't care about her condition or what she's been through since you took her," I replied curtly. My focus was singular, to see her and finalize what had already begun. Carlos gestured toward the open door behind him. As I started toward it, I stopped just shy of the threshold. "Is she on medication?" I asked flatly. Carlos shook his head. "No. She's clean, but she probably wishes she wasn't," he said with a dry chuckle. "She's been kept conscious the whole time. No escapes, no numbness. She's a broken woman now, trained and ready for her new life." With that, I stepped through the doorway. The room was brightly lit, its starkness amplifying the tension. Janet sat tied to a chair in the center, her posture slumped and lifeless. Her hair was disheveled, her face gaunt. I circled her slowly, finally coming to a stop directly in front of her. She didn't look at me. Her vacant gaze was fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder, and the sparkle that once lit her eyes was completely gone. I spoke, my tone calm but deliberate. "For the rest of your life, Janet, you're going to remember one thing. You brought all of this on yourself." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "I endured your mood swings, your coldness, and your growing indifference. But your betrayal, your infidelity, and the sheer disrespect you showed me, that was the line you chose to cross." Her silence was deafening, her face unmoving as if carved from stone. I leaned in slightly, emphasizing each word. "You'll spend the rest of your life paying for your choices, for what you've done. Robert already paid his debt to me, and now it's your turn." Speaking slowly, deliberately, I wanted to ensure she understood. My words weren't just a declaration, they were a verdict, a sentence. Whatever shred of humanity or warmth I once felt for her was gone, extinguished by her actions and the consequences they had set in motion. "It was me who brought you and your lover to justice," I said firmly, my voice steady as I delivered the final blow. I reminded Janet of how I once loved her, but emphasized how that love had long since turned to loathing. Any trace of warmth or compassion I once felt had been extinguished by her betrayal. I let the silence linger before continuing. "Carlos assured me you'll be well taken care of where you're going. As well taken care of as their best horses and cattle." My words dripped with disdain, meant to strip away whatever dignity she might have clung to. For a moment, I stood there, watching her. A single tear formed in the corner of her eye, but that was the only response I got. She didn't speak, didn't plead, didn't protest. That lone tear was her silent acknowledgement of everything she had lost and everything she had brought upon herself. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room. The Ford sedan was waiting outside, and the driver whisked me back to St. Peter's. The 11 o'clock Mass was just ending as I re-entered the church, blending into the crowd as if I'd never left. From there I drove straight home, a hard knot twisted in my gut, the weight of everything I'd done and seen pressing down on me. The only solution, as always, was a tall glass of Jim Beam to drown it out. It's been 3 years since that day, and I've almost forgotten Janet entirely. Her absence left no lingering traces in my life. Shortly after her disappearance, I sold the house we shared, severing the last connection to our failed marriage. Detective Becton's cases, Robert Tolson's homicide and Janet's disappearance, have long since been relegated to the cold case files. These days, I spend more time with Carmine at the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge. That young stripper who once tempted me? I've sampled her offerings more than a few times now. She's a reminder that life, while messy, still has its fleeting pleasures. Marriage, though? That's off the table for good. My 5 years with Janet taught me that marrying a woman is like inviting chaos into your life. My parents warned me, and as much as I hate to admit it, they were right. Kids really should listen to their parents more often, though we rarely do. Not long ago, I learned it was Amanda Stata who had sent me that damning email. She had been Robert Tolson's lover before he dumped her for Janet. I never thanked her for exposing their affair, nor did I figure out how she got her hands on those photos of Janet and Robert. I suppose it doesn't matter. She got her revenge at the same time I got mine. There's a saying about the wrath of a woman scorned, and if nothing else, Amanda proved just how true it is.